largest reserve of fresh water in the world, and which plays an vital and irreplaceable role in combating climate change and in mitigating and staving off temperature rises and global warming. And in so doing, and in acting to preserve and care for the Antarctic, we're taking action to prevent the further melting of the ice caps, particularly in the Antarctic. The Antarctic is also a perfect natural laboratory for science, and scientists from countries in all continents around the world make use of this natural resource to advance science. Secondly, Chile is contributing to the development of our understanding of astronomy. The unique combination of high peaks, low atmospheric humidity and clear skies means that almost 70% of the space observation capacity of the world is currently located in Chile. Thirdly, we have been contributing to the international community by setting up marine protected areas. Thanks to our pride in our natural resources and hard work, more than 42% of Chile's seas now are under environmental protection orders. Moreover, 21% of our land is protected in the form of parks, reserves or national monuments. Fourthly, we have been actively pursuing and developing the energies of the future. Chile lacked the fossil fuels and pollutants that we used in the past, but we are immensely rich in the clean and renewable energies of the future. High levels of solar radiation in our deserts represent a huge potential for the generation of solar energy. The strength and regularity of the winds that blow across Chile mean high potential for generating wind energy. We are also moving forward in developing the energies of tomorrow by developing green hydrogen, which will benefit all of humanity as a non-greenhouse gas emitting fuel. The abundant reserves of copper and lithium in our country gift us with great potential in terms of electric transport. Fifthly, we have been connecting South America with Oceania and Asia through the Trans-Pacific Fiber Optic Cable, a catalyst for promoting greater regional integration between our region and the Asia-Pacific region. It also acts as a catalyst for promoting innovation and nurturing a digital society. Sixthly, we have been producing safe and healthy foodstuff that supply the tables of the entire world with multiple different products. The last few months have been the most draining and difficult in recent history for Chile and the entire world. I am certain that the Chilean people will demonstrate once again their nobility and solidarity, that are the hallmarks of our peace. And the Chilean people will also show their resilience and level-headedness. Together we will forge and create an ideal country in which to be born, grow up, study, work and to start a family and to grow old. A common and shared home, the home for all Chileans, a home in which we can have different views, but we can respect one another and our differences nonetheless. We will be ready to dialogue, to talk and to reach agreement. And in thus doing, we will be able to build a better country and a better future, which we can then bequeath with pride and with hope to future generations. I wish you all a very good day and many thanks for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Chile for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the General Assembly on the occasion of the virtual General Assembly debate a pre-recorded message of His Excellency Mr. Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the Republic of South Africa, delivering the statement in his capacity as the chairperson of the African Union. Thank you.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago, the United Nations was established to introduce a new world order to achieve peace in the world. It was the dawn of a new era of global cooperation, forged in the aftermath of one of the darkest periods in the history of humankind. In 1945, the world was in crisis. It was counting the devastation wrought by war, devastation and plunder. Today, we are in the throes of another crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. The pandemic has cost nearly 1 million lives. It has deepened human suffering and uprooted communities, destroyed livelihoods, and plunged economies into turmoil. But just as the founders of the United Nations once stood united for the greater good, so too do we stand united to confront this grave threat. In this crisis, people across the world have extended the hand of solidarity to other people in other nations. From the north to the south, humanity has been galvanized into action. We have formed international partnerships to ensure that there is equitable access to medical equipment and supplies. Many nations have set up extensive social support systems to protect citizens whose jobs, businesses, and livelihoods have been threatened. Our response to the COVID pandemic has demonstrated the heights that can be attained when we work in the spirit of friendship and solidarity. If we are to build a common and inclusive future in the aftermath of COVID-19, it is this solidarity that must endure. In the words of Nelson Mandela, he said, "It is human solidarity, the concern for the other, that must be at the center of the values by which we all live." As the African continent, our response to coronavirus has been swift and effective. We have a continental strategy to fight the pandemic, being driven by the regional economic communities in our continent. The African Union has established a COVID-19 response fund and launched a groundbreaking African medical supplies platform to ensure that all nations have access to the necessary equipment and supplies. Nonetheless, the pandemic will inevitably set back our developmental aspirations. The resources we've had to redirect to fighting the pandemic have set back our efforts to provide housing, healthcare, water and sanitation, and education to our people. When the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, delivered the 18th Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture in July 2020, he called on the nations of the world to forge a new social contract and a new global deal. He said we must create equal opportunities for all, that we must advance a more inclusive and balanced multilateral trading system, that debt architecture must be reformed, and that there should be greater access to affordable credit for developing countries. It is a call that we as South Africa wholly endorse. It is in the spirit of this new global deal that we call on the international community and our international partners to support the rollout of a comprehensive stimulus package for African countries. This will enable African countries to not only mitigate the health impacts of COVID-19, but to aid us in the immense task of rebuilding our shattered economies. To ensure that no country is left behind, we reiterate our position as the African Union that economic sanctions against Zimbabwe and Sudan should be lifted to allow their governments to respond adequately to the pandemic. We also call for the suspension of interest payments on Africa's external and public debt. As the African Union, we are encouraged by the collaboration of the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN towards finding solutions to debt sustainability in developing countries. This pandemic has highlighted the urgency with which we must strive to meet all the sustainable development goals, but more importantly, Goal 1, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. For until we eradicate global poverty, we will always fall short of realizing the vision of the founders of the United Nations. We must expand economic opportunities to all people around the world, but most especially to the young, to the women, and the vulnerable people in the world. We must boldly pursue avenues of redistribution and redress as a means of advancing shared prosperity. We must deal decisively with the rot of corruption that is robbing our people of the opportunities and services that are their right. Together, we must raise our level of ambition to ensure that every man, every woman, and every child has an equal chance at a better future. It is a future free of hunger, disease, insecurity, and war. It is a world that affirms the dignity and the worth of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, or social circumstances. The year 2020 will be remembered for the massive groundswell to push back the frontiers of racism under the umbrella #Black Lives Matter movement. As a country that has known too well the anguish of institutionalized racism, South Africa supports the demands for swift action against racism, whether committed by individuals, companies, officials, or a state. South Africa calls on the United Nations to spare no effort to end prejudice and intolerance in all its forms and whatever and wherever it is found. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." As we mark the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action, we must intensify our efforts to empower women and girls. It is the right of women and girls to be full and equal participants in the workplace, in political life and decision-making, in the economy, in obtaining an education, and in society as a whole. South Africa is proud to be a member of the UN's Generation Equality Campaign and has prioritized the eradication of gender-based violence and femicide. At a continental level, we are working to finalize and adopt an AU Convention on Violence Against Women during the course of this year. AU member states are engaging on measures to promote financial inclusion, preferential procurement, and preferential trade agreements for women. As African countries, we continue with our effort to silence the guns once and for all through conflict resolution and peace building. Cooperation between the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council has contributed to improved peace and security in the Darfur region of Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Mali, and the Central African Republic. It is imperative that this collaboration is institutionalized and that the financing of AU peacekeeping operations is addressed and resolved. South Africa is currently serving its second year as an elected non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We have used our tenure to promote international peace and security by advocating for the peaceful settlement of disputes and inclusive dialogue. The current composition of the Security Council does not reflect the world in which we live. On the 75th anniversary of the UN, we repeat our call for greater representation of African countries on the Security Council, and that this be taken up with urgency at the intergovernmental negotiations. It is only through a reformed and inclusive UN Security Council that we will be able to collectively resolve some of the world's most protracted conflicts. As we celebrate the founding of an organization dedicated to freedom and equality, the people of Palestine and Western Sahara continue to live under occupation. We repeat our call for an end to the illegal occupation of Western Sahara and for the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. We further call for the lifting of the economic embargo and blockade of Cuba. Your Excellencies, we have no choice but to work together to address the climate change crisis. As we rebuild in the aftermath of this pandemic, we have an opportunity to place the global economy on a low-carbon, climate-resilient developmental path. We must advance the principles of the green and circular economies, not just for the sake of environmental sustainability, but because of the opportunities for job creation and economic growth. The global recovery effort must place climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and support at its center, in line with the Paris Agreement and other multilateral environmental commitments. As the founders of the UN stood at a crossroads in 1945, so do we 75 years later. They answered history's call to craft a new order for a world in crisis. Today, we battle the fires of a deadly pandemic, of racism and prejudice, of violence, war, and extremism, and above all, of poverty and inequality. The order we seek to build must be rooted in solidarity, equality, and unity of purpose. The coronavirus pandemic has presented us with a choice. It is a choice between the global cooperation envisaged in the UN Charter or the pursuit of narrow self-interest and unilateralism. It is a choice between tolerance or prejudice. It is also a choice between economic justice or growing inequality. The path we choose now will determine our collective destiny. Though we face the most daunting of prospects, we have at our disposal the most potent force. It is the solidarity and friendship upon which the United Nations was founded. When history faithfully records the global response to the worst health emergency of this century, let it be said that we stood and acted as one, that we provided leadership, and that we gave the peoples of all nations hope and courage. The best and most fitting legacy of this 75th session will be that through our actions, we gave true meaning to the term United Nations. South Africa reaffirms its commitment to the ideals and the spirit of the UN Charter, and to sparing no effort to bring about a more just, peaceful, and equitable world. May our cooperation deepen and may our solidarity endure. Let us make sure that all our efforts leave no woman, no child, and no man behind, and that no nation is left behind. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of South Africa for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor Presidente.
President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, as we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the role of this body is increasingly relevant at a time when humanity is confronting such unexpected and exceptional circumstances. Only multilateralism, solidarity, and shared cooperation will allow us to overcome the major global challenges both of the present and of the future. In this spirit and understanding, it is my honor to present to you the pre-recorded message of His Excellency the President of the Republic of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. Thank you very much.
Señor Secretario General, señor Presidente.
Secretary General, President. A global pandemic has changed everyday life drastically. Almost overnight, millions of people have been infected and thousands have died, even when their life expectancy should be longer, thanks to progress and development. Hospital systems with high-level services have collapsed, and the health structures of poor countries are affected by their chronic lack of capacity. Drastic quarantines are turning the most populated cities into deserts. Social life is non-existent except on digital networks. Theatres, discos, galleries, and even schools are closed or being reimagined. Our borders have been closed. Our economies are shrinking, and our reserves are dwindling. Life is undergoing a radical redesigning of age-old ways, and uncertainty is replacing certainty. Even close friends are unable to recognize one another due to the masks that we have to wear to protect us from contagion. Everything is changing. Much like the urgent need to find a solution to the pandemic, there is an urgent need to democratize this crucial organization, the United Nations, so that it effectively meets the needs and aspirations of all peoples. The sought-after right of humanity to live in peace and security with justice and freedom, the basis for unity among nations, is constantly under threat. Over $1.9 trillion are being squandered today in a senseless arms race promoted by the aggressive and warmongering policies of imperialism, whose leader is the present government of the United States, which accounts for 38% of current global military expenditure. We are referring to a markedly aggressive and morally corrupt regime that despises and attacks multilateralism, uses financial blackmail in its relations with United Nations system agencies, and that, in a show of unprecedented arrogance, has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and the Human Rights Council. Paradoxically, the very country in which the headquarters of the United Nations is located is also walking away from fundamental international treaties such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This host country rejects the nuclear agreement with Iran reached by consensus. It promotes trade wars. It scraps its commitment to international disarmament control instruments. It militarizes cyberspace. It expands coercion and unilateral sanctions against those who do not bend to its designs, and sponsors the forcible overthrow of sovereign governments through non-conventional war methods. Together with such action, which thumbs its nose at the long-standing principles of peaceful coexistence and respect of the right of others to self-determination as the bedrock for peace, the Donald Trump administration is also manipulating, for subversive aims, cooperation in the spheres of democracy and human rights, while in its own backyard there is an explosion of practically unchecked expressions of hatred, racism, police brutality, and irregularities in the election system and in the voting rights of citizens. There is an urgent need, as I've said, to reform the United Nations. This powerful organization, which emerged after the loss of millions of lives in 2 world wars, and as a result of a global understanding of the importance of dialogue, negotiation, cooperation, and international law, must not put off any further its modernization and democratization. Today's world needs the United Nations in just the same way as the world in which the United Nations was born did. Something very special and profound is foundering, as evidenced by the daily and permanent violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter and by the ever-increasing use or threat of use of force in international relations. There is no way to keep in place any longer, as if it were part of the natural and immutable order of things, an unequal, unjust and anti-democratic international order, an order where selfishness prevails over solidarity and the mean interests of a powerful minority over the legitimate aspirations of millions of people. Notwithstanding the dissatisfactions and the demands for change that, together with other states and millions of citizens around the world, we are presenting to the United Nations, the Cuban Revolution will always champion the existence of this organization, to which we owe the meager but nonetheless indispensable multilateralism that has been able to withstand overweening and overbearing imperialism. More than once, in this very forum, Cuba has reiterated its willingness to work for the democratization of this House and for the upholding of international cooperation, for which the best defense is the United Nations itself. As stated by the first Secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Army General Raúl Castro Ruz, and I quote, "The international community can always count on Cuba's honest voice in the face of injustice, inequality, underdevelopment, discrimination and manipulation, and for the establishment of a more just and equitable international order which really centers on human beings, their dignity and well-being." End of quote. President, turning my attention back to the seriousness of the present situation, which many blame solely on the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it is essential to say that the impact of this pandemic extends far beyond the health sphere. Due to its nefarious consequences, the staggering death toll and the damage it has wrought on the world economy, together with the deterioration of social development, the spreading of the pandemic over the last few months has brought in its train anguish and despair that has affected leaders and citizens in practically all nations. But the multidimensional crisis it has unleashed clearly shows the great failings of the dehumanized policies imposed by the dictates of the market. Today, we are sorrowing witnesses of the disaster that the world has been brought to by the irrational and unsustainable production and consumption that is part of the system of capitalism. We have also been brought to this brink by decades of an unjust international order and the implementation of ruthless and rampant neoliberalism, which has widened inequalities and sacrificed the right of peoples to development. Unlike discriminatory neoliberalism, which tosses aside and discards millions of human beings and condemns them to survive on the leftovers from the banquet enjoyed by the richest 1%, the COVID-19 virus does not discriminate. Rather, its devastating economic and social effects will be lethal among the most vulnerable and those with lower income, as whether they live in the underdeveloped world or in the pockets of poverty to be found in the major industrial cities of the world. According to projections of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, the 690 million people who were already going hungry in 2019 might be joined by a further 130 million this year as a result of the economic recession caused by the pandemic. Studies by the International Labour Organization, the ILO, claim that over 305 million jobs have been lost and that the livelihoods of more than 1.6 billion workers are at stake. We cannot deal with COVID-19, hunger, unemployment, and the growing economic and social inequalities between individuals and countries as unrelated phenomena. There is a pressing need to implement integrated policies that prioritize human beings over economic profits or political gain. It would be a crime to postpone decisions that should have been taken yesterday and indeed must be taken no later than today. It is vital that we promote solidarity and international cooperation to lessen the impact of the phenomena we're witnessing. Only the United Nations, with its world membership, has the required authority and reach to resume the just struggle to write off The unpayable foreign debt, which, aggravated by the social and economic effects of the pandemic, is threatening the very survival of the peoples of the global south. President, the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak and the early signs that it would bring a pandemic did not catch Cuba off guard. With the decade-long experience of facing terrible epidemics, some of which were provoked deliberately as part of the permanent war waged against our political project in Cuba, we immediately implemented a series of measures based on our main capabilities and strengths, namely a well-structured socialist state that cares for the health of its citizens, a highly skilled human capital, and a society which involves the majority of citizens in its decision-making and problem-solving processes. The implementation of those measures, combined with the knowledge accrued over 60 years of great efforts to create and expand a high-quality and universal health system, plus scientific research and development, has made it possible not only to preserve the right to health of all citizens without exception, but also to be in a better position to face the pandemic. We have been able to do this in spite of the harsh restrictions of the long-running economic, commercial and financial blockade being imposed by the US government, a blockade which has been brutally tightened over the last 2 years, even in these times of the pandemic, something that shows that it is a key component of the hostile US-Cuba policy. The aggressiveness of the blockade has reached a qualitatively higher level that further underscores its role as the real and determining impediment to the management of the economy and the development of our country. The US government has in particular intensified its harassment of Cuban financial transactions, and as of 2019 has been adopting measures that violate international law to deprive the Cuban people of the possibility to buy the fuel they need for their everyday activities and in order to be able to pursue their development. In order to damage and demonize the Cuban Revolution and others it defines as adversaries, the US has been publishing spurious lists lacking legitimacy by which it arrogates to itself the right to impose unilateral coercive measures and unfounded assessments on the world, obliging others to abide by them. Every week, the government of the US, issues statements attacking Cuba or imposes new restrictions. Paradoxically, however, it has refused to term as terrorist the attack that was carried out against the Cuban embassy in Washington on April the 30th, 2020, when an individual armed with an assault rifle fired over 30 rounds at the diplomatic mission of Cuba and later admitted to his intent to kill. We denounce the double standards of the US government in the fight against terror and demand a public condemnation of that brutal attack. We demand a cessation of the hostile and slanderous campaign against the altruistic work of Cuba's international medical cooperation that, with much prestige and verifiable results, has contributed to saving hundreds of lives and lowering the impact of the disease in many countries. Prominent international figures and highly prestigious social organizations have acknowledged the humanitarian work undertaken by the Henry Reeve International Medical Brigade for disaster situations and serious epidemics and called for the Nobel Peace Prize to be awarded to this body. Whilst the US government is ignoring the...
All right, so that's the United Nations virtual meeting of world leaders there. Pre-recorded speeches from some of the planet's biggest powers. We had the United States President Donald Trump came out guns blazing there against China. Very own President Cyril Ramaphosa in his capacity as the chairperson of the African Union, speaking on behalf of the African continent, taking stock of what the COVID-19 has done to livelihoods in the continent. Talking about the setbacks to developmental efforts, of course, and basically saying that they're repeating that call for that greater representation of the African continent on the Security Council. All right, so that's where we have to leave it for today. We thank you so much indeed for taking the time. The full view up next from myself and the entire SA Today crew. Good night.